For this episode, Neil and I went out to Upwaltham to visit the site where a Lancaster bomber from the famous 617 Dam Busters squadron crashed in February 44.
Hi Neil, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here, Tim.
Well, I'm going to call it the Dam Busters podcast. We're okay calling it the Dam Busters podcast, aren't we? We're really going to focus on the crash site of a Lancaster bomber. We are on Upwaltham Down, which is just off the A285 between Petworth and Chichester. We have an amazingly clear day. We can see Bignor Hill, anyone that knows the South Downs way will know the two aerial masts on Bignor Hill. We're just south of that, or south of the South Downs way, and we're on this lovely point. There's a cairn with a lovely RAF logo on a cross. There's a plaque on a plinth with a note about the crash site. And we've just come from the church, Upwaltham Church, which is just off the A285, and met the lady that was preparing for the service tomorrow. In the church, there's a lovely plaque with a note about both a Lancaster crew, which we're going to discuss today, and a Dakota crew as well. Yeah. So it's actually well worth visiting, and there's pictures of Lancaster bombers, and there's a booklet with information about it. It's well worth a visit. But Neil, you've done a bit of research. Tell us about the crash site and mission on the...
We're at the top, as you say, Upwaltham Down or Littleton Down. We're at 253 metres above sea level. We're quite high. And we saw a crash site recorded on a website on the internet. We think the crash site is about 400 metres down the hill towards Upwaltham village and the road. Mm-hmm. And as Tim said, this is a gorgeous location for the cairn and the memorial to Lancaster, which crashed here sometime after 8:20 in the morning on the 13th of February after coming back from an overnight raid on the Anthea viaduct right on the Mediterranean coast of France near Cannes.
Okay, so this is February 1944. It's the Dam Busters squadron, the famous 617 squadron. And they're coming back from the south of France, and that's the reason that they stopped at Ford, because it's such a long mission to the south of France and then back again. So they've stopped at Ford on the south coast, as opposed to going back to their base in Lincolnshire. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And we can talk about the crew a bit later. Just concentrate on this mission, which is really interesting. Right. It's the Anthea Railway Viaduct. It's a key infrastructure route between France and Italy. It's already been attacked 3 times on the 16th of September 43, 11th of November 43, and now on the 12th of February 44. It was absolutely key to stopping reinforcement to the German forces in Italy. And it's worth just looking at the amount of effort that's gone in. Certainly in September 43, it was 8 Lancasters from 617 Squadron, and another 4 from 619 Squadron. Mm-hmm. And it's such a long way that those aircraft, none of them hit the viaduct. It was a reasonably unsuccessful mission, and 1 aircraft was lost. Later on, November 43, again, 9 Lancasters. It's such a long way that they finished the mission in Bilda near Rabat in North Africa. Because obviously, once you've gone to the Mediterranean, you might as well go on there, because otherwise they need to be refueled. Right. So for this mission...
And safer airspace as well, going over the Mediterranean to North Africa rather than back across occupied Europe.
So this mission, I think on the way out, they came from Woodhall Spa in Lincolnshire. Mm-hmm. They refueled at Royal Naval Air Station Ford, which we can probably... It's a lovely clear day. We can certainly see Bognor, and obviously just to the east of Bognor would have been Ford, near Yapton. So they refueled on the way out, as far as we're aware. This was 10 Lancasters. Then they refueled on the way back. Right. The mission itself was, as far as the mission statement was, that they failed to sever the railway connection. So the viaduct was damaged. The infrastructure didn't fail completely. 1 of the Lancasters was hit and the bomber was killed. That aircraft then went on to Sardinia, which is in American hands, and landed there because obviously the aircraft was severely damaged. One of the other crew was damaged. The other 9 Lancasters made their way back right across France to Ford for refueling.
Okay. Significance of hitting railway infrastructure in the south of France on the Italy border is, of course, the 8th Army are moving up through Italy. There's a focus on hitting infrastructure in the run-up to D-Day. That will intensify, obviously, closer to D-Day. It's also really important that the attacks are spread out across the whole of Europe, because this is an exercise in keeping the Nazis guessing about what the probable site of invasion is. There are attacks on infrastructure across Europe. There's a real focus on that.
It's a real transition from some of the nighttime attacks that the RAF were carrying out on German cities, where they weren't specific targets. And obviously we'll get onto that, the level of casualties. The casualties on the German civilian population were immense as well. But this is more what we would call a tactical strike on a specific target.
And it's worth saying at this point, we'll come back to this, the idea of a specialist precision bombing, striking critical infrastructure has all come from the 16th of May Dam Busters raid the year before, 1943. Up until this point, as you say, the idea of strategic bombing had been, aiming for a city, aiming for a rail yard, aiming for these really big targets. The success of the Dam Busters raid in 1943 proves a concept that actually these sites can be targeted. Later in the war, the rocket launch sites in northern France will be targeted. Later in the war, the Tirpitz battleship will be targeted in a Norwegian fjord. And 617 Squadron, because, as I say, they've proven the concept, they've proven that these small targets can be hit with precision munitions or specially built munitions in the case of the Dam Busters. And we'll come on to the connection between the direct connection between the Dam Buster and this particular aircraft and the crew of this aircraft in a second. But the concept's proved, and that's what 617 are doing here, right?
Yeah. They're good at that. They've also, prior to this mission, 617 have carried out concentrated raids on SOE targets in France, for example, where they've dropped, again, precision raid. They've been given a target. So they've been used in a slightly different role to other RAF Bomber Command groups.
Now, Neil, I want to come on to the aircraft. And definitely we want to talk about the Dam Busters, but you've done a lot of research on this crew.
A normal crew of a Lancaster is 7. On this Lancaster, there was 8. And the reason for that was that the INT officer had actually debriefed them at Royal Naval Air Station Ford and was cadging a lift back to Woodhall Spa in Lincolnshire.
Right.
So he was squadron leader Tom Lloyd, who was 52 years old. He was the oldest Bomber Command fatality in 1944. He'd been a Royal Engineer officer in the First World War and been awarded the DSO in the First World War. Of the crew of 8, 5 had gallantry awards, which I find amazing. The aircraft captain was squadron leader William Suggett. He was Royal Canadian Air Force. He was only 24 years old, but he had been awarded the DFC, Distinguished Flying Cross. He'd flown at least 60 missions with the Royal Canadian Air Force. The Royal Canadian Air Force had a rule in place at the time that once you'd flown 60 missions, you were taken off operations, basically. He wanted to stay on operations and basically transferred to the RAF. Amazing. So he was actually in the RAF. And you've also done a bit of research there. The flight engineer was John Pulford. He had also been awarded the Distinguished Flying Medal, which was for other ranks. He was a flight sergeant because...
But the Pulford connection is that Pulford is the engineer for Guy Gibson on the actual Dam Busters raid. In the film, we do more research than watching the film. But in the film, Guy Gibson turns to Pulford and says, steady speed. He's the engineer. And we'll come on to this in a second, but the engineer, there's no co-pilot in the Lancaster. The guy sitting to the left of the pilot is the engineer.
Flight engineer. I'll expand on that. So what the introduction of heavy bombers in early 42, Bomber Command, even at that stage, were realising they're going to run out of pilot. And the second pilot didn't do much flying, was their assessment. What they did, they put the call out to ground crew, fitters and mechanics to become flight engineers. So you didn't have a second pilot, you had a flight engineer instead. And they were all rushed through the system because they could predict they were running short of air crew at that stage. And interestingly, there were some squadrons which were all Canadian or all Australian. You'd find that they had an RAF flight engineer because obviously they hadn't had time in Canada or Australia to put people through courses. So sometimes you'd have a crew of 6 Canadians and the flight engineer would be RAF, and the same with the Australians as well.
So that was amazing what you told me about Pulford, because he'd started off as ground crew, then been promoted to, volunteered for...
He would have volunteered for the course. He was a flight sergeant. He was awarded the DFM for the Dams raid, and he was only 24 years old. Going through the rest of the crew, there was Johnny Graham, was Royal Australian Air Force. He'd have been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. John Dempster was Royal Canadian Air Force. He was also a flying officer. He was the youngest person in the crew. He was 20. He had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Medal. He was the tail gunner. he'd shot down 2 enemy fighters on raids over Germany. So he'd been awarded the DFM at the young age of 20. And as already mentioned, Tom Lloyd at 52 had been awarded the DSO. And the other members of the crew were Norman Davidson, Royal Canadian Air Force, Sydney Hall, Royal Australian Air Force, and John Ritchie, Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve. So 3 Canadians, 2 Australians, and 3 Brits. A real mix of crew.
Thinking of Pulford, when you think of the detail of the raid, think of Gibson going round again. Obviously, Gibson's first run, the bomb hits the dam, but it doesn't break the dam. So then it's on to the next Lancaster. He's already dropped his bomb. So he flies around to provide cover and to distract. I mean, imagine what his engineer must have thought. He said, I'm going round again. You're doing what?
Bomber Command, over the course of the Second World War, lost 55,573 men. That's a hell of a lot of guys killed.
It is the front line in Britain's war because from May 1940, evacuation of Dunkirk. Obviously, there's the war in North Africa, which we don't forget, and we'll talk about that separately. The bombing campaign is the front line, or this is how Britain is going to take the war to Germany. This has been a war plan. So if we go right back to the inception of the RAF and the days of the RAF after the First World War, Trenchard and the RAF come up with a concept which is strategic bombing. This idea that a war can be won by bombing alone. And that is how the RAF is pitched to the government. Actually invest in this because it's a war-winning mechanism in itself. And you can destroy German industry and win a war in that way. And of course that links directly to the concept of the dam busters, the idea that you could destroy the dams that are powering in the Ruhr Valley. This is an idea from the very early days of the RAF. Britain could have a strategic bombing force, and that's why we have Bomber Command and Fighter Command. Well, that's just not the case in Germany. It's a tactical bombing force that supports the army in a Schwerpunkt. It's a completely different concept. And if we go back to our first podcast, when we looked at the Junkers 88 crash site on the South Downs Way, I think this is a really interesting story about the development of the bomber concept, because a Lancaster can carry 2.5 or 3 times the bombing capacity of the Junkers 88. The Junkers 88 at the time, 1940, a state-of-the-art bomber with riveted aluminium, and it can cruise at 200 miles an hour. Well, just 2.5 years later, Lancaster bombers are flying deep into Germany at night, flying at 200 feet above the ground to avoid radar and dropping a precision munition. I'm just going back to the Junkers 88. They're flying around their target is a RAF site that has nothing to do with Fighter Command. On the first day of the Battle of Britain, well, 2.5 years later, the Dam Buster 617 Squadron are able to target 3 dams right at the core of German industry.
And the ordnance involved at astonishing levels. The high capacity cookie bombs, these are the ones which have, I think, a higher proportion of explosives. And you're talking about anything from £4,000 to £12,000 bombs. We don't know exactly what ordnance they were carrying against the Anthea viaduct. The Grand Slam bomb was £220,000. These are big munitions that they're carrying. And the only aircraft that can carry it is the Lancaster. In fact, for the Grand Slam bomb, the Lancaster had to be amended and had to have a whole load of stuff taken out and a bigger bomb bay and the bomb bay doors taken off.
Strip out the protection for the pilots. Great.
Going back to the casualty rate, that's a hell of a lot of people. The 55,000, and out of a force across the course of the war, Bomber Command of 125,000, that's an attrition rate of 44.4%, 50% chance of not making it through with Bomber Command. And that compares worse than an infantry officer in the First World War. A British infantry officer in the First World War, they were obviously targeted because they stood out, and infantry officers paid the price in the First World War. And the average age was 22, and some of them were as young as 19. And as we know, one of the guys in this crew that was sadly killed was only 20 years old.
Important to say, all volunteers. You volunteered for Bomber Command. And it's a remarkable dynamic because they are going to war at night, and they're coming back to an airfield in Lincolnshire or in this case in Ford, fight at night and back during the day.
You read various anecdotes about how they cope with this attrition rate. And on this raid, there's 10 Lancasters. One has landed in Sardinia with 1 crewman dead and 1 injured, and another 8 have been lost on the way back. That's the daily attrition rate. It's about 5%. If you've got 20 aircraft, you might lose 2. And that's day in, day out. And every time, do the maths, every time a Lancaster goes out, you're losing 7 guys. So that's why it hurts so much. Sadly, your grandfather's brother was Bomber Command.
His name was Lewis Young, and he was my great uncle. and he was the pilot of a Manchester bomber. Now, Manchester was the predecessor of the Lancaster. It looks exactly the same in the body, but was two-engined and had, I think they were called Napier Vulture engines, but I might be wrong about that.
Yeah, no.
It had a shorter wingspan, two engines, and was very underpowered. He was killed on a mine-laying operation over Denmark in March 42. This was just a couple of months before the Lancaster came on board. So talking about the aircraft for a second, the evolution of the Manchester to the Lancaster, there was sort of Manchester Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3, and the tail design changed. It went from a traditional tail to the iconic Lancaster tail with the twin fin. The wingspan was increased, and crucially, the engine changed to using four Merlins, and that's a sort of proof of concept. It's worked fantastically well in the Merlin engines worked fantastically well in the Spitfire and the Hurricane. So put four of them on a Lancaster. Yeah, there are stories of Lancasters returning on one engine. Yeah. That's the evolution of the Manchester into the Lancaster. And yes, my great uncle was killed flying, as I say, on operation over Denmark. And he was in Guy Gibson's squadron before 617 squadron. So his commanding officer was Gibson.
Oh, right.
Before Gibson went on to form 617 squadron. The Dam Busters is my favourite story of World War II. It's everything about it is remarkable. There's the idea that the Dam Busters was an elite squadron. Well, that's not quite the case. Gibson was allowed to bring in crew that he knew were good guys, but really it was just regular guys who had just trained to be able to do this in such a short amount of time. The story of the Dam Busters is very well known. A bit that you and I can relate to is the navigation side of things, because you and I have done so much orienteering and been lost so many times. The Lancasters had to fly over Europe on the way to the dams at 200 feet. So they're clipping the tops of pylons. They're literally at treetop height. And it's so difficult to navigate when the ground is moving so quickly beneath you. If you're traveling at 200 miles an hour, imagine trying to do the navigation on that, the speed that you'd be moving across the map. It's amazing that they found it at all.
Worth mentioning the crash in a bit more detail. It's such a lovely day today and a lovely view. As Tim said, we can see the Isle of Wight, we can see the mast, we can see all the way around, we can see the sea.
We can see the sea, and that's probably going to be key here.
Yeah, because they had landed at Ford on the 13th of February. Some accounts suggest they had to wait. So they had breakfast, they had to wait for the int officer, Tom Lloyd, to finish. Maybe they were late taking off, and there was mist fog at 150 feet. There's some suggestion that some of the other Lancasters took up and went above the cloud level, whereas Squadron Leader Suggett, by all accounts, seemed to be a very experienced pilot with 60 missions under his belt. He was under the cloud cover, and they took off from Ford, and unfortunately, sometime after 8:20 in the morning, they ploughed into the side of this hill.
Something in that, insofar as the Lincolnshire, where these guys were based, there's a reason they're based there. It's because it's completely flat on the east coast of England. Whereas here, Ford is obviously down by the coast, but we're just inland here, and we're up at 200 metres. The South Downs does rear right up.
And this is the first bit of high ground, and we probably see the route they took. They came up from just to the east of Bognor. There's a valley that runs where the 285 is, and unfortunately, the account is they hit trees, and then they were fully fueled up. The aircraft hit the ground and exploded. 3 people from the farms below, 3 men come out, one of them called Chapman, I can't remember the names of the others. They came up to try and rescue the people, and they managed to get Squadron Leader Suggett out of the aircraft. But he had severe burns, but they tried to get into the rest of the aircraft, but there was, by all accounts, they were concerned with exploding ammunition, and there was a lot of fire. They just couldn't get into the rest of the aircraft. Sadly, Squadron Leader Suggett died 2 days later in St Richard's Hospital in Chichester. The 3 farmhands or whatever from up Waltham were praised by King George VI for their bravery, because they received burns trying to rescue the crew.
Well, Neil, thanks for taking me up and showing me this site. It's amazing.
To end, I guess a fitting tribute on a lovely day and a lovely view to the 55,000 who perished in Bomber Command.
That's a good note to end on. Thanks so much, Neil.